Okay, welcome everyone. Glad you could all make it. We've got 12 people here at the moment. I'm hoping some more people will show up as the time really ticks in to the time of the webinar. My name is Andy Hockley. I'm the coordinator of LAMSIG, the Leadership and Management Special Interest Group for IATEFL. And I'm delighted to welcome today Gerhard Erasmus, who is actually a new member of our committee in LAMSIG and works for the British Council in Taipei, Taiwan. And it's great to have him here. And obviously, as you know, he's going to be talking about teacher development needs and understanding what those are. And in a second, I will hand over to Gerhard and get out of your way. But just to let you know, if you have any questions or any thoughts or things you want to comment on as the talk goes on, please do so in the chat box, which I'm sure you've all seen at the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. And if Gerhard sees them at the time, he will respond to them if it makes sense. Or otherwise, I'll make sure that he gets to, if there's a question that he needs to answer, I'll make sure that he gets to see it at the end, and he can respond to it maybe in a question and answer sessions right at the end. We don't anticipate to go on for any longer than an hour, so that's what you should be looking at, possibly slightly less than an hour. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Gerhard. Thanks very much, Gerhard, and enjoy.
Thank you, Andy. Before I get going, the 7-Eleven in Taiwan has a special on cups. So this is a Hulk cup. If you see it, there's water in it. I'm not getting attacked by the Hulk. It's a quick look at what we're going to do tonight. We're going to look at what can be expected from teachers once they've finished an initial teaching qualification, and what problems there are with qualifications and expectations. We'll do the same thing for in-service qualifications like the Delta or the Trinity Dip. And then we're going to look at how to incorporate that knowledge into teacher development and teacher management. Some of you have already said where you're from, and I know I put that on the next slide. So if you want to say it again, you are welcome to do so. So there's the first question. What do you think should be covered in an initial teacher qualification? So something like a CELTA or a Trinity Cert. So the type of qualification that a teacher can do before they start teaching if they've never been in a classroom. Please use the comment box. So if you haven't already stated your where you're based, where you're from, please tell us that. Your role obviously optional. And then what do you think should go into these courses? I'll be reading and responding as they start appearing. We've got 2 people saying planning, teaching techniques and methods, language analysis, evaluation, differentiation, different staging models. Another one for assessment. Mark says different classroom interactions, methodology, technology, and management maybe. Classroom management. Developing as a teacher, that's a pretty good one. learner needs, learner differences. If you look at what everybody's typed, there's a lot of similarity. I mean, the key thing of an initial teacher training course is that teachers need to learn how to teach. Unfortunately, there are a few issues with courses. Not necessarily. I'm not saying with CELTA and Trinity Cert. I'm just saying in general. The first thing is deciding what you want to cover. Time is an issue. A CELTA is 120 hours. The Trinity Cert is 130 hours. And while it sounds like a lot of time, if we're looking at something like lesson planning, the way that you'd plan a lesson that introduces grammar or vocabulary is not the same way that you'd plan a lesson that introduces receptive skills or develops receptive skills. And it's not the same as a lesson that develops productive skills. So actually you'd need at least 3 sessions on lesson planning. And if you start looking at all the things that need to be covered, timing is unfortunately a massive issue. Another issue that there is when you decide what to cover is some CPs might never have been in a class, CPs being course participants, or you might have a course where you've got 8 or 10 people and they've all been teaching for 2 or 3 years, so they're bringing some knowledge to the classroom. The where your course is delivered is also very important. If you're introducing things like L1 interference, for example, or common pronunciation errors of certain groups of learners, what we cover in Taiwan is definitely not going to be the same than what's covered in other places. So again, that influences what you decide that goes into the course. And sometimes the less is more issue, where the key thing of an initial teacher training qualification, and I do think CELTA and Trinity Cert does this, is to make the teacher at least somewhat successful in the workplace. Now, there are many other issues, and there has been a lot of negativity, I guess, in terms of what CELTA does and what Trinity Cert does and what the initial teacher qualifications do. But overall, the key thing is that their objective is to make the teacher at least somewhat successful in the classroom, so that they're at a point where they can start teaching and then potentially develop into a more competent teacher. Now, what can graduates actually do? This is taken from the CELTA handbook on page 13 if you want to read it yourself. That's a rough screenshot of what's on the page. So I'm not going to go through it in much detail. It's very similar for the Trinity Cert. So if you look at it critically, it says they need guidance. So even somebody that has an A pass or a pass A, it actually says they need minimal guidance, but it still says they need guidance with, for example, lesson planning. If it's just a normal pass, it just says they can plan lessons effectively with guidance. They can generally reflect on lessons and therefore guide the development, but it is something that they also need help with. They might not have had any exposure to different contexts. So, for example, somebody that does a CELTA in Australia and then lands in Japan or Taiwan, and they suddenly started walk into a classroom with teenagers or kids, it's very difficult coming straight out of that qualification and just going, this person is a CELTA, so obviously they're going to be fantastic. But maybe they've only taught 60 or 120 hours of adults, and now they're suddenly required to teach kids. They might not have had any exposure to young learner classes, or for example, somebody that does Trinity Cert with us in Taiwan, we do use adults, but they would definitely not have had any exposure to English for academic purpose or those types of classes. So the key thing really is that although they have a CELTA or a Trinity Cert, it doesn't make them a superhero teacher. And in terms of the management or the line manager or the person responsible for the development, it's important to understand what they can actually do so that you can guide their development better and help them develop as teachers, rather than just go, I employed 2 people with CELTAs and they couldn't do what I expected them to do. And it is something that I hear more often than I'd like to hear it. I did have a quick look at other programs. I decided not to put any names of programs on here because my research didn't make me feel very confident. So the first question I have actually is, can they be trusted? I'm sure there are good other programs out there. I know, for example, the Cert 4 TESOL in Australia is a fairly good program. The two key questions for me when I look at other programs is, A, are they externally moderated? And is there observed teaching practice with somebody that's a qualified observer? The reason I say this is when I then know what they've done in the course, I can be fairly certain that they have actually done that to an extent where I can employ the teacher and then help them develop. It's not like you're trying to train someone from scratch. The information in terms of what some of the other programs that I looked at put in their curriculums and their on the schedule was very similar to what I think you'd see in a CELT or a Trinity Cert. But then you also have to ask yourself, and the same goes for a CELT and a Trinity Cert, if you've done a 2-hour session or a 1 or 2 hour session on adapting the course book, how much can you expect the trainee to have mastered at the end of 2 hours? In our Trinity Cert, we run 80 1.5 hour sessions, and then we have 10 hours of face-to-face contact with the tutors. So the point being, you're looking at a session for adapting the coursebook maybe. If you're doing one session, it's an hour and a half. In our specific course, we did 2. So they've done 3 hours of work, but there's no ways that they'd have the same level of insight into how to adapt a coursebook and how to make the most of the coursebook if you're comparing it to someone that's done an MA. 3 hours is not really that much. And it's unfair to expect a teacher that's just started in their career to have a lot of insight in an area where they've spent an hour and a half or 2 hours to 3 hours in a room discussing and learning about how to do it. But if you are aware of what the little bit that they can do, it's a lot easier to guide them and to explore the area a lot more and then really help them develop as a teacher. So, time for you to share again. I've looked at very briefly, why it's difficult to say. You can criticize CELTA and the Trinity Certs and all the qualifications, but they only really have 120 to 130 hours. You can't teach them everything about teaching in that amount of time. They're fairly forthcoming, saying a person needs guidance and they need help once they've completed the course. So the question then is, how can we support those teachers? Please, let's say for 2 or 3 minutes, just type your comments in the comment box, and then we can look through them, and if there's anything interesting, maybe talk about it for a bit. Co-teaching, peer teaching, peer observations. Asan is a very good one. Managing their confidence. And I actually took one of Sandy's blog posts and incorporated it into this webinar. So you'll see it in a bit. George mentioned the teacher buddies or buddy program. It is something that we're trying to put in place, that we've been working on where I work, and there's a lot of positives to it. There's definitely something that I think is needed and very often overlooked, getting experienced teachers to help new ones. there's a lot of talk of mention of mentoring also. It is not something that I have on my next slide, but I do think it's something that is very important, yes. Special training to make sure that the teachers, their needs are identified and they receive training in terms of that. All right, that's basically 2 to 3 minutes that's gone by. I'm glad to see there's been quite a few um, very useful comments. I think some of them may be better than the things I was going to say. Keeping a reflective journal is a very good one. Action research, um, tricky to set up, but something that's definitely worthwhile. Things that just a few notes that I had, guide their lesson planning, and then allow for collaborative planning and teaching, but make sure that it's scheduled. Don't just assume that because they work together that they're going to do it together. And that's one of the things that came up with our buddy program. It's very nice saying you're his buddy, but if you don't actually schedule time for them to be together in a classroom, then it doesn't actually lead to what you want it to lead to. In fact, with guide their lesson planning, teachers don't have to type out massive long lesson plans. It is something that you'd expect them to do when they're doing a CELTA, when they're doing a Delta, or a Trinity Cert, or a Trinity Dip, or something like that. But in terms of guiding their planning, making sure that the flow of the plan is logical, that there's a variety of interaction patterns, and that it actually achieves the aim that they set out for the lesson. Regular meetings to guide reflection and development. So actually sitting down with the teacher more than just once a year, saying, okay, so what areas would you like to get better in? And it's very tricky for someone if they've just come out of a CELTA, and I'm talking even with people that have been teaching for a few years, because they don't know where they need to get better or where they want to get better. So the next thing is using a teacher framework to allow them to notice areas where they can improve, and maybe to let them notice areas where they didn't even know that there was the possibility to get better at in these certain areas. Do developmental observations regularly. Somebody mentioned peer observations. I think that's very, very useful. I also think it's very useful that they actually have an academic manager or a line manager that observes them maybe once every 2 or 3 months at least, to help them through their development. And then the last thing, don't expect perfection. You can't expect somebody that has been teaching for 3 months and they did a 120-hour course to be an absolute rock star teacher. It's just not going to happen. You can expect that person over a period of 3 or 4 years to develop into a very, very good teacher. A few people mentioned that they do team teaching with new teachers. I actually also think that sometimes if there's trainers, I know CELTA does do this, but smaller little training programs where even new trainers that get dropped into a training session, they've never actually seen anybody train other than them being trained as on their CELTA or on their Delta. Sandy's asking, what teacher frameworks have you used? I do have that on a slide that's on a bit later, so it's on the way. So we've looked at CELTA and Trinity Cert. I'm now going to have a brief look at diploma level qualifications, and I'm specifically speaking here about Delta and Trinity Dip. I'm sure there are others, but I'm focusing primarily on these two. So this doesn't have to be Delta, it could be Trinity Dip. I just use Delta because it's a lot faster to type it. Consider the situation. A Delta candidate passed the Module 1 exam. They did Module 3 with a focus on teaching young learners. They did their 4 assessed lessons in Module 2 with young learners and covered grammar, past tense and narratives, lexis, comparative and superlative adjectives, speaking, storytelling tasks similar to the Cambridge Wiley Movers for Flyers exams, and reading, short description of different clubs in a school. Because they have a delta, they get assigned an EAP class and they struggle. Why? Let's say about 2 minutes. What problems does this situation make you think of? Just to add, the problem is not with the delta. The problem is with what was expected of the teacher. Saying the timetable made assumptions without knowing anything about what a delta actually is. Assessment is primarily covered in the Module 1 exam and then the assessment of your learners in Module 2, but in this case it was all young learners. I don't want to overgeneralize here, but I do think, based on what Sani says, I actually think a lot of people aren't sure what actually goes into a delta. And yeah, George says that delta doesn't necessarily equate to EAP expertise or proficiency. It's a completely new skill. It is something that the teacher could learn. It doesn't mean that they can't do it. It just means they have absolutely no experience with it. So, what do you think the academic manager should have done? So, if you were that person's academic manager, what would you have done differently? Quite a few people typing, which is good. So yeah, a lot of it, a lot of what's being said here is pretty much the same as what I said earlier in terms of how to support the teachers. And yes, they need to receive training. They need to read about EAP classes. They need to observe somebody doing an EAP class, potentially collaboratively plan a few classes, and then teach. Now, somebody that has done a Delta, their theoretical knowledge is a lot higher than somebody that's done a CELTA, and their ability to reflect on what actually goes into different tasks is probably a lot more developed than somebody that's done a CELTA. But the main point is that it doesn't mean because they've got a Delta, they can necessarily just walk into a certain type of class and teach it. They do need guidance, they do need training, and they do need help. So, sorry, Sani's saying, did they have any EAP experience elsewhere? The situation that I've just described, sometimes the reverse happens, where somebody has done it, they've worked in, for example, the UK or Australia, They've taught adult classes primarily. Some maybe even taught EAP classes. They've got a CELTA, they've done a Delta, they've maybe even done a Master's. And then they travel to Asia to teach, and they end up in a class with young learners, and they're completely out of their depth. So I guess the main point of all of the things that everybody said here, training, reflection, observation, co-teach, co-mentoring, collaborate, all of these things are important even if you've done a diploma level qualification. And it's important that managers are aware of this, are aware of what teachers can do when they've done a certain qualification. Maybe if you're interviewing somebody that's done a Delta, ask them what their 4 lessons were on. Ask them what their focus was in their Module 3 assignment. So if it is an area that you might want to help them develop, that you're aware of it. You're not just making an assumption that they've got a Delta, so they're going to be an absolute rock star in whatever class you put them, because it's unfair to that teacher. So another situation, again, time for you to type a bit in the chat box. A teacher did a CELTA and a Bachelor's of Education. They want to do another course. Sorry, that's a spelling mistake. They want to do another course. Do they do a diploma or do they do a master's? So would you suggest a Delta or a Trinity diploma or a master's? And if it is a master's, what should the focus be? Applied linguistics, education, TESOL? And then what, in terms of that, what's the difference between all these different master's programs? So use the chat box just saying what would you suggest they do, and maybe with a reason. Lots of people typing. All right, for those of you still typing, I'm going to stop you there because George and Ryan has pretty much said what I think the main point is. It is important to know what their actual personal needs and career development plan is. Sandy touched on that. Personally, I would suggest doing a diploma level qualification first, because you can get recognition of prior learning or credits if you're doing a master's after Delta or Trinity cert. However, it's very important to know where is it that they want to go, and how they see themselves developing as a teacher, and exactly what it is that they actually want to do. And then also the choice between, do you do a master's in applied linguistics, do you do one in education, do you do one in TESOL, do you maybe do one in management? It's very difficult to try to figure out what people can do if you don't know what their actual objectives are. Sandy did say that some of the master's courses actually include the diploma, which is true. But very often, if you're looking at ads, for example, job ads, it says somebody with a master's, and somebody with a master's in applied linguistics has a very, very different skill set than somebody that has a master's in education or somebody that has a master's in TESOL. And again, I don't have a situation discussing this because I think it becomes a little bit more complex as you move towards master's qualification. But somebody could have a master's in education and be a really good teacher and not be super good at linguistics. or somebody could have a master's in applied linguistics and turn out to not be a very, very good teacher in the classroom, but they might be a really, really good trainer. So it's very tricky if you're just basing your judgment of the person off the qualification that they've had. And I think, again, it is important if you're doing interviews with teachers or if you have induction and training programs in your organization, that you look at what kinds of master's programs teachers have, and maybe let them do peer training on areas of areas of expertise, and then also let them fill their maybe gaps in their knowledge in by looking at attending sessions that maybe some of their peers are presenting that have more depth of knowledge in another area. But there's no ways that a master's program in applied linguistics education and TESOL that they're all giving you exactly the same skills. This is something that I stole from Sandy. The problem, I think, also is that teachers do qualifications like a CELTA or a Delta or a Master's, and then they start feeling like they're imposters, like their knowledge is lacking because they are required. For example, the Delta teacher gets dropped into an EAP course. There isn't enough time to spend the level of investigation that you do in a Delta into an EAP course if you're going to start teaching it in 2 weeks' time. And then obviously you start feeling like an imposter. So I just put 5 or 6 points over there, mostly because I think later on when I speak about managers and management, I think this actually also comes up. Teachers need to know that and I think this is something that should come from the manager responsible for their development, that doubt is a part of self-reflection and development. You feeling like you're not a superstar in every class that you're teaching, it happens to everybody, and it's okay to doubt yourself and doubt your knowledge, because it gives you the opportunity to reflect and to develop. So when you do feel doubt, experiment with things until it works, rather than think that you're not good at doing it. It's impossible to please absolutely everybody. I know a lot of people that would say if someone has done a CELTA, they need to be a good teacher, or CELTA is a bad qualification. That's not reality. It just doesn't work like that. So it's impossible to please everyone as a teacher. It's impossible to please everyone with a certain type of course. Nobody will ever know everything, and that should be fine. And I think that needs to be communicated to teachers, regardless of the qualifications that they have. There will be criticism, and I think that should be used as a springboard for exploration, rather than saying or feeling like you're being taken to the cleaners. And then the very last thing, teachers, I think if they feel that they are supported and that they don't have to know everything, it makes it a lot easier for them to be honest with the students and say, look, okay, I really don't know this, but I'll check it and I'll get back to you, rather than try to make something up and be wrong about it, and then figure out later that they were wrong, and then that doubt starts eating away at them. So in terms of supporting teachers, it's important that you understand the qualification, and very often what goes into the qualification is available. So you will know what sessions were covered in a certain qualification, and very often also the limitations. I referred earlier to the CELTA. It's very clear if you look through the CELTA curriculum what actually gets covered, what you can reasonably expect teachers to be able to do when they've done a CELTA, and limitations in terms of the fact that if they walk into your organization with a CELTA, they need assistance and guidance and someone to help them develop further. They cannot do it completely on their own. It's important that you identify areas where teachers can continue to develop through consultation with management. And I'm a big fan of using teacher and trainer frameworks. I might not use them exactly the way that I think lots of other people use them. But Sandy asked us earlier, I use the Cambridge English framework. I use the British Council framework. I use the English Australia framework sometimes, and Equals also has a good framework that I use as well. There is another one, and I wasn't expecting anybody to ask me. I cannot remember what it's called off the top of my head. but I basically generally refer to 5 or 6 frameworks because I think that they complement each other. I do use the Cambridge English and the British Council frameworks the most often. One, because I work for the British Council, and two, because I've spoken about the Cambridge English framework fairly often, and I know those two frameworks the best. It doesn't mean that I think they're the best. I'm just very used to working with them. So, in terms of comments or questions, there is another 3 or 4 slides looking at management and what to do if you're an academic manager and you're not teaching anymore and you have to develop teachers. But let's take a quick 3 or 4 minute break. Any comments, any questions? If you have any, please type them in the comment box and I can have a look at them. And then I'll move on to the last little bit of the webinar. Thank you very much for the compliment on my cups. Sandy has put a link there to her ELT playbook. I have seen some of the activities and they're pretty good. So, yeah, by all means, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Esther says, as a CELTA trainer, I do 1 course a year and obviously it doesn't help much with developing my skills as a trainer. Any suggestions? Well, for one, I wish this was available when I actually started doing training. Niall has 2 trainer development courses. Cambridge has to train the trainer. I wish I was able to do those courses before I started training. They're excellent. So one, I would look at one of those courses, maybe 2 of them, and maybe try to get into smaller training things like TKT or something like that. The Cambridge, have I frozen? Sorry, I think my my screen froze for a bit. The frameworks are available online. You can just Google Cambridge or the BC framework, and you'd be able to see it. Nile ELT. If you Google Nile ELT, they have a lot of online courses, and there's also the Nile MA and Trainer Development course, which Sandy just mentioned. They're all very, very good. Yeah, the John Hughes blog is very good. All right, so let's move to the last little bit of the webinar. Sometimes you end up in an academic manager's role, and you're no longer in the classroom, and it becomes tricky because I think sometimes managers start doubting if they're still as good as they used to be when they were teachers. So as an academic manager, some of the things that you'd have to do at some point in time is you have to deal with opposing ideas. Sometimes teachers feel that the way they're doing it is the right way, and I will say that I think sometimes those teachers are potentially right. Approaches to teaching might be different. It's important to look at if the approaches are principled rather than if it was the way that you did it when you were still a teacher. It's important that you guide growth as a teacher and growth as a manager and engage in experimental practice. Now, it is, George did mention, how do we get teachers to become more reflective? I think as managers, we need to do the same thing, actually, especially if you're no longer in the classroom. And there's a variety of ways that I think you can do that to make sure that you consistently stay aware of what's happening. So a few tips that I think are important. I'm lucky in the sense that I still have about 3 to 6 hours of teaching a week. So I am still in the classroom, but I do think it might move to a situation fairly soon where I'm no longer in the classroom at all. And I find these things have worked for me. Stay on top of second language acquisition and education research. Read, as we say to teachers, read. I think managers, even if you're not teaching, should still read about teaching. And then use your teacher's knowledge and experience. That should be teachers with an apostrophe. So the teachers who work for you, their knowledge and experience is a springboard for your own growth and development. If you're seeing them teach and you see something where, for example, they're using some technique or methodology, or they're just doing something in the classroom and you're not sure why they do it, rather than criticizing it, try to figure out why they're using it and use that as a springboard for developing your own awareness and knowledge. Take part in online and social media discussions related to teaching and teacher development. And I think a lot of managers do that in any case. Maybe do a MOOC or some kind of a course. Beware of imposter syndrome as a manager. I think sometimes I think it's fairly common. If you're a teacher, then a senior teacher, academic manager, director of studies, and eventually you feel so much that I don't know. Am I an imposter? And I think those points that I put up earlier apply to this as well. So it's important, I think, that as a manager, that you're also aware that you will also have limitations. And I do think it's important that you observe often both the teachers that work for you and other teachers. So I've put in brackets the online, video, YouTube. There's a lot of places where you can get lessons and observe teachers teaching, and then think about how you can use what you've seen to stay on top of being in the classroom, even if you're not there. A question here. I can answer that in a second. So just closing comments and questions, if there are any. Please use the chat box for that. There is a question that I think I've missed. Sorry, Maria, you've asked, can you suggest some? Are you referring to online videos? Mark said that he'd like to start asking teachers to record themselves. If you're in a center that teaches kids, it's a lot more difficult to video your teachers, depending on what kind of child protection policies and things you have. But something that you can also do that I didn't have on here earlier is you can record teachers giving instructions, and you can record students speaking. You just can't record their video record it, and very often that that gives you some good insight into clarity of instructions, and how students are interacting, because there's no pressure with the teacher leaning over their shoulders trying to hear what they're saying, but getting them to record themselves, it also gives you a good indication of something that they can do, and it makes, I think, the manager a lot more aware of what students in certain levels can actually do, because I think sometimes a problem is that we either over or underestimate what the students can do, and then when we observe the lesson, we look at it from, why did the teacher not do this? Because the student should be able to do this, and maybe they can't. Yeah, audio recordings, very, very, very useful. And actually, something Sandy mentioned, recording my observation feedback is one of my jobs for next year. We're doing a train the trainer course in Taiwan right now, and one of the things that I have suggested is to give someone feedback, but record yourself doing it, and then reflect on actually the type of questions that you've asked, and maybe potentially was there a better way to get the teacher to think about the lesson a bit more. I think we're heading towards 7:50 over here, so the hour plus 50 fairly soon. So I'm going to flip to the last slide. If you do think of a question or something that you'd like to ask me, any comments, any links, if you want some of the links that I had here, or if you'd like a copy of the slides, feel free to email me. The first email is my at-home email. The next one is my British Council email. And I might, for the sake of ease, just type it for you in the chat box, then you can just copy and paste it, because it will be easier than I'm trying to write it down. Either of those are fine. Yeah, I think if you're getting a teacher to observe another teacher, that's fine. I think it becomes very tricky if it's a manager observing another manager. It sounds like a great idea, but it takes up quite a bit of time, especially if a lot of your interaction with your staff is one-on-one. And it could be a little bit intimidating if there's two managers and one teacher. But it might be a very good idea in some contexts. I'm not sure, George, what the question is. Yeah,
Thank you,
I am
Gerhard,
referring
and
to
thanks
feedback
everyone for being here and
that a
for being
teacher
so
gets given after
active and
observation.
responding
So,
to Gerhard's questions
while I
and
think it's good that teachers
keeping the flow of
investigate,
things going. I thought it was a really, really interesting session. I'm I hope that you all did too. It seems like people were very involved and very engaged, so I'm guessing that you did. So I would like to thank Gerhard very much for this very interactive, very interesting, and actually very practical and useful session, and that you were able to get a lot from the session. LAMSIG run set webinars 3 times a year, and IATEFL will have a webinar every month. Esther asks, how can you get to know about such webinars? Just follow us on social media or follow our website, Esther. That's for Esther. That's for our that's for the LAMSIG ones, and also IATEFL. You can follow IATEFL on social media as well, and they will announce their own webinars. And I'm sure that there are others around that others can maybe help you with. So thanks very much, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Saturday, whatever's left of it. For some of us, like Gerhard himself, most of it's gone, I think. But for many of us, it's sort of only halfway over, and for some people, it might only just be beginning. So again, thanks very much for coming. The recording of this webinar will be available from our website, from the LAMSIG website, soon. That's just as soon as I get time to download the recording and stick it up on the website. So that will be hopefully later today, but quite possibly tomorrow. And if you need anything else, just let us know. Thanks very much, everybody. And bye.